from a county road. It looked like every other surplus shell scattered across the Montana flats after the war. A Quonset hut, corrugated steel, arched low against the sky, half swallowed by snow. The kind of structure the government sold off by the thousands when the camps closed, cheap, fast, ugly, and about as warm as a tin can left on a fence post in January. Nobody slowed down when they drove past it. Nobody gave it a second thought. But sometime between the first hard freeze of October and the worst cold snap anyone in Cascade County could remember, something strange was happening to that hut. Something quiet. Something that, from the outside, looked almost like a mistake. By February, when the temperature dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius, and stayed there for 11 days straight, what was happening inside that building would make every neighbor who had laughed quietly to themselves feel a particular discomfort of being wrong. This is the story of a man who didn't want glory. He just wanted his children to stop waking up with frost on their blankets. And in solving that one modest problem, he stumbled onto a principle of heat storage that builders in colder climates had understood for centuries, and that post-war America had almost entirely forgotten. If you've ever wondered why some old structure stayed warm on almost nothing while modern buildings bleed heat through every wall, stay with this. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every week, we bring you a real technique from history that worked when survival depended on it. This is one of the best we've found. His name was Elias. Local records from the Cascade County area refer to him simply as a veteran homesteader who had taken over a small parcel of dryland wheat country after returning from Korea in 1948. Oral accounts from the valley describe him as quiet, methodical, and not particularly interested in what his neighbors thought of his property. The Quonset hut had come with the land, a leftover from a temporary military equipment depot, still bolted to a poured concrete pad. Elias had no money to build a proper cabin. He had no particular reason to. The hut was already standing, and standing was enough. For the first winter, it was not enough. Steel conducts cold the way a cast iron skillet conducts heat. Completely, instantly, without argument. On still nights, the interior walls of the hut would sweat and then freeze. The condensation built up in the corrugated channels and turned to ice along the lower edges of the arch. His 2 children slept in coats. The wood stove in the center of the floor roared through cord after cord of firewood and managed to keep the space livable, barely, as long as it was fed constantly. The problem was not the stove. The stove was fine. The problem was the shell around it. Every BTU the fire produced, the steel walls shed back into the Montana air, within minutes of the fire dying down. There was no storage, no mass. The heat had nowhere to stay. Elias understood this the way a man understands something not from reading, but from being cold. He didn't frame it in engineering terms. He framed it in simpler language, according to a neighbor who spoke with him that spring. The walls give it all back too fast. He spent the summer thinking about that, and then quietly he started hauling stones. The river stones came from a dry creek bed about a quarter-mile east of the property. Flat, dense gray-brown. Mostly sandstone and basalt, palm-sized to head size, the kind of rock that had been sitting in moving water long enough to lose its sharp edges. Elias began stacking them against the exterior of the hut's north and west faces, the 2 sides that took the brunt of prevailing wind. He mixed a rough mortar from lime, sand, and water, and set the stones in courses, working from the base of concrete pad upward along the curved steel wall. He wasn't trying to cover the whole hut. He focused on the lower 8 feet of the arch on those 2 sides, building the stone layer out to between 8 and 10 inches thick. To anyone walking past, it looked like a man had decided to half-bury a tin building inside a rock pile. Here is what was actually happening, stated in the simplest possible terms. Stone, particularly dense sandstone and basalt, has a high thermal mass. That means it can absorb a large quantity of heat energy and release it slowly over many hours. A 10-inch wall of dense stone absorbs warmth during the day, when the stove is burning, holds that energy in its molecular structure, and releases it gradually through the night, long after the fire has gone cold. Physicists call this specific heat capacity. Frontier builders called it common sense. The steel shell behind the stone was no longer exposed to the wind. The stone acted as a buffer, slowing the rate at which cold penetrated inward, and slowing the rate at which warmth escaped outward. The corrugated steel, which had been a liability, now became a secondary layer. The stone absorbed the outdoor cold before it ever reached the metal. There was one additional effect Elias likely didn't calculate, but benefited from regardless. Stone, once warmed, radiates heat as infrared energy, the same gentle, penetrating warmth you feel sitting near a fireplace long after flames die. A warm stone wall doesn't just insulate, it heats, slowly, steadily, without flame. The total stone weight on those two faces came to somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 pounds, based on the dimensions described in local accounts. That is a significant thermal battery, one that costs nothing to run once it is warm. Nobody tried to stop him. That's the thing about this kind of opposition. It doesn't organize itself. It just comments, shrugs, and moves on. The man who ran the hardware supply in town, a practical, experienced fellow who had built or supplied most of the structures in that part of the county, heard about the stonework and offered his assessment without being asked. According to a neighbor who was present, he said something close to, "Freeze-thaw will pull that away from the steel inside of 2 winters. He'll have a pile of rubble and a crack pad." It was not an unreasonable concern. Freeze-thaw cycling, the process by which water infiltrates porous material, expands as it freezes and slowly wedges things apart, is a legitimate enemy of mortared stone in cold climates. It has destroyed chimneys, foundations, and retaining walls across the northern states for as long as people have been building them. What the hardware man didn't account for was the geometry. The stone was on the outside of the steel, not bonded to it structurally. It was a cladding, not a load-bearing wall. If sections cracked or shifted, they could be remortared without affecting the hut itself. Elias had not asked the stone to hold anything up. He had only asked it to hold heat. A neighbor 2 properties over was less technical in his assessment. He drove past once, slowed down, looked at the half-stone, half-metal shape against the flat white of the fields, and reportedly said, "Looks like he's building a root cellar around a barn." Then he drove on. The children at the county school apparently had a name for the place, something along the lines of the Rock House, but they said it without particular cruelty. It was just strange. The kind of strange that belongs to people who are still figuring things out, or who have already given up trying to look normal and decided to be warm instead. The winter of 1949 to 1950 was not unusual for Montana by reputation. But the stretch that arrived in the first week of February was the kind of sustained cold that separates the memorable winters from forgettable ones. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius on February 3rd, and did not climb above minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius for 11 consecutive days. The wind came in from the northwest at a steady 18 to 25 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to figures that local accounts describe as the coldest in living memory for that part of the county. Firewood, which many families had stacked dry in late autumn, began to present problems. Some stacks had been poorly covered. Some had absorbed moisture from a wet November and hadn't had time to season properly. Green or wetwood burns a fraction of the efficiency of drywood. It wastes energy boiling off its own moisture before it contributes any real heat. Families who had estimated their winter supply based on normal consumption found themselves burning through reserves faster than expected. Chimney draft became an issue in several homes. When the temperature differential between the inside of flue and the outside air becomes too extreme too quickly, cold air can press back down into stack, a phenomenon called backdrafting, pushing smoke into the living space and making the fire difficult to maintain at all. 3 families in the broader area, by local account, had to temporarily relocate to stay with relatives when their heating situations became unmanageable. Elias kept his children home. Stay with me through the end of this, because the number that came out of those 11 days is the one that changed how people in that valley thought about building for the rest of the decade. A neighbor named Calhoun, one of the few people who had paid close attention to the stone work over summer, stopped by on the morning of February 12th, near the end of the cold snap. He had run low on dry wood and was making the rounds to see if anyone had extra. What he noticed when he stepped inside the hut is recorded in a brief account he gave to a county agriculture extension worker that spring. The interior was, in his words, warmer than it had any right to be. The stove had not been fed since roughly midnight. It was 7 in the morning. The outside temperature was minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. The interior temperature of the hut, measured later that day with a simple mercury thermometer by the same extension worker, was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius at floor level, with no active fire. Calhoun's own cabin, a standard wood frame structure of similar floor area, had dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius by dawn on the coldest nights, requiring him to keep the stove burning every 3 to 4 hours through the night to prevent his water pipes from freezing. The comparison Elias offered when asked about his wood consumption was straightforward. He had burned approximately 40% less firewood than his immediate neighbors during the cold snap, and his stored wood, kept in a simple lean-to against a stone-clad west wall, sheltered from wind and snow, had stayed dry throughout. The stone wall on the north face, when Calhoun pressed his hand against the interior side, was still detectably warm 14 hours after the last fire had gone cold. This is thermal mass doing exactly what physics says it should. A 10-inch wall of dense stone at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius holds enough stored energy to keep a small insulated space above freezing for between 10 and 16 hours without any additional heat source, depending on exterior temperature, air sealing, and the thermal envelope of the surrounding structure. Elias's numbers were within that range. He had not invented anything. He had remembered something. Calhoun asked Elias to walk him through the stonework that same morning. He asked where the river stones had come from, how the mortar had been mixed, how long the curing had taken. Elias answered plainly, without particular pride. By the following autumn, Calhoun had laid a partial stone course along the north wall of his wood-frame cabin. Not as ambitious as Elias's project, only 4 feet high and roughly 6 inches thick, but enough to change the thermal character of his coldest wall. He reported burning noticeably less wood that winter, though he kept no precise measurements. Word passed the way it always passes in sparse country, through practical conversation, through observation, through the quiet currency of people who have watched each other manage hard winters for years. Nobody called his system. Nobody wrote it down in those terms. It was just something some people had started doing. By the winter of 1952, local oral accounts suggest that at least half a dozen homesteads in the surrounding valley had incorporated some version of stone cladding or heavy masonry buffering on their north or west exterior walls. The specific details varied. Some used field stone. One family used salvage brick from a collapsed granary. Another used a combination of stone and earth banking, essentially a partial dugout berm, against the back wall of their frame house. The hardware man who had predicted the stone would pull away from the steel never mentioned the prediction again, as far as anyone recorded. The stone on Elias's hut was still intact and still mortared as of the mid-1950s, by which point the freeze-thaw concern had been answered by simple observation. The mass of stone on those two faces kept the outer surface of the wall warmer than the freezing threshold on most winter nights, reducing the number of full freeze-thaw cycles the mortar experienced significantly. The root cellar around a barn became, in the quiet way that useful things become tradition, just the way that some people built. The Quonset hut was never designed to be a home. It was designed to be temporary, a fast, cheap enclosure for equipment, supplies, or personnel in transit. It had no thermal strategy because it was never meant to stay in one place long enough to need one. What Elias did was not complicated. He did not have engineering training. He did not have a material science textbook. He had a cold family, a dry creek bed, and a clear understanding of a single observable fact. Some materials hold heat, and some do not, and the difference matters more than almost anything else when the temperature drops to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit and the wood supply is finite. River stone holds heat, dense, heavy, slow to warm and slow to cool. This is not ancient wisdom in the mystical sense. It is physics. The same physics that explains why a cast iron skillet holds temperature better than a thin aluminum pan, why stone floors feel warm underfoot in the evening after a sunny day, why the massive fireplaces of old European farmhouses could heat a room for hours after the fire was nothing but ash. The principle is called thermal mass. The measurement is specific heat capacity. The practice is as old as the first human who stacked warm rocks around a sleeping place and noticed that morning was less terrible. Elias didn't invent it. Neither did the Finnish builders who perfected masonry heaters. Neither did the Pueblo people who oriented their stone structures to absorb and release solar heat with mathematical precision. What they all understood, and what post-war American construction largely forgot in the rush toward cheap steel and thin insulation, is that a building that stores heat is a fundamentally different object from a building that merely traps it. One of them works when the fire dies. The other doesn't. There is no moral here that needs to be explained. The stones speak for themselves. 52 degrees Fahrenheit at 7 in the morning, 11 days below zero, fire cold since midnight, children still asleep and warm. That is the number that the valley remembered. If this story stayed with you, like it, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? We read every one.